Welcome back to another episode of the Infirmary, everybody. Thank you for being here. Okay, today we are talking about this thing called progressive overload and how you can actually use it to develop as an endurance athlete. Progressive overload is another one of those terms that gets tossed around all the time in endurance coaching and training circles. And I think that people don't actually take the time to consider what it is and what it means and how we can actually effectively use it in our training and our coaching of others. So, okay, what is it in the first place? What are we talking about when we're talking about progressive overload? Progressive overload, and this is a canned definition, and then I'm going to talk to you about a more practical one. Progressive overload is the steady and systematic increase in training load in order to continually force an athlete's body to adapt and develop in the ways that we want it to develop. Okay, what does that actually look like in practice? The best way to think about progressive overload in practice is that you are doing more of something from one training cycle to the next. And what happens is because you are doing more than the previous cycle, your body is in this constant state of basically trying to catch up. Because if you are doing just a little bit more than what you did last week, if you did the same thing as you did last week, your body would be like, oh, sweet, awesome. We're used to this. We can already do this. We can already express it. And it wouldn't be a challenge for your body. So it'd be a pretty easy week to accomplish. But then, of course, you're not doing what you want to be doing in endurance training, which is getting better. And so if you do a little more of something over the course of the following training cycle from the previous training cycle, then your body is forced to adapt to that new training load. Okay, I can hear what everybody is already thinking. Sweet, so I just have to keep doing more and I keep getting better forever. Well, you know that this actually isn't true. You've probably tried something like it in your own training. And today we're going to walk through how to actually do this effectively. And this is kind of putting the end first, but you can't just keep loading and loading and loading and loading. You do have to rest. And we are going to talk about how resting works and when you know that it is time to actually load. If you're not a coach, then why is this episode going to help you today? Well, if you're self-coached or if you're just trying to figure this stuff out on your own, then today's episode, what it's going to tell you is what are basically the three different progressive overload buckets of too much, not enough, and just right. So basically our Goldilocks progressive overload. Okay, part one. The first thing that we need to do if we are going to talk about progressive overload and learn how to use it, we really need to measure what we are doing at the moment. And there's tons of different ways that you can measure your training load. You can just go raw hours. This is something that people did for a long time. And all they would do is be like, okay, I did 60 hours in November. I'm going to do 65 hours in December, and then I'll do 70 hours in January. And that works, but no 1 hour of endurance training is the same. An hour at threshold is a very different hour than an hour of recovery. And so if we're just using training hours, that gives us a really crude metric for doing progressive overload, but it was used successfully in a lot of different ways for decades. And if you want to keep things really simple and it seems to work for you, then progressively overloading just training hours can work. It's not very specific or it's not very exact, and it can get you into some problems of, well, am I doing too much intensity? Am I not doing enough intensity at all? Am I simply doing basically the same thing from month to month? If you bump up the volume but drop the intensity from November to December, you might have gone up to 65 hours, but you might have ended up doing the same exact training load between the 2 months. And this is a really good moment to remind everybody that there's a bunch of different stuff that you can actually progress. So you can progress volume, and we usually think about volume as duration. So just how much time are you doing something? You can progress intensity. So in that case, what you would be doing is you do slightly harder workouts from week to week, or you can also do more of the harder workouts. So maybe you're doing threshold intervals, and last week you did 2x20, and then this week it's the same intensity, but you do 3x15. So that's kind of progressing duration, but we can also talk about it as progressing the intensity of threshold training. So sometimes it helps to talk about training load, and training load is usually thought of as duration times intensity. And this is what would kind of help you avoid that problem of the athlete who did 60 hours in November and then 65 in December, but the intensity dropped, so the load remained exactly the same, so they didn't really progress anything. So one thing that you can do is you can think about progressing training load. And now that's going to require some sort of system to actually track the training load. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But you know what? You can also progress things like skill work. Maybe you do, let's go to like a music paradigm. The old chestnut that if you want to get good at a musical instrument, the best thing to do is to practice 30 minutes a day. So that gets you 3.5 hours of practice a week. Well, if you want to get better sooner, you could just do more skills work. So maybe you do 40 minutes a week, and that's going to get you another 70 minutes each week. So you're bumping from 3.5 hours to 4 hours and 40 minutes. So you can progress skill work. You can progress recovery. And this is what we're talking about when we're talking about basically taking an off season, is that we are going to a much bigger amount of recovery than we usually do. And it's interesting to think about progressing recovery because most of you guys are wanting to get faster or more enduring. And so you wouldn't think about progressing rest. But one of the things that we want to do in the off season is to actually get as rested as we can so that the following season is better. So you can progress recovery as well. One method for training load that you are probably already familiar with if you are an endurance athlete who uses apps and websites and things like that is the old training stress score, or TSS. And TSS leads into these other terms, CTL, ATL, and TSB. So CTL is chronic training load, ATL is acute training load, and TSB is training stress balance. We don't need to get totally into the weeds here, but the way that the TSS system works is every workout generates a number for that TSS. So let's just say you do a workout and it is 100. Your CTL, or your chronic training load, is basically the average TSS of the last 42 days, the last 6 weeks. So we're looking at a bigger period of training. ATL is going to be the average TSS of the last 7 days, so it's a much shorter time frame. And this is an important distinction because obviously what you did in the past 7 days is going to influence what the last 42 days looks like. And so it's a shorter trailing average. And very often ATL is going to be much more responsive to time. If you have a big training week, it's going to shoot up a lot. And if you have a low training week, it's going to drop a lot. And then CTL, because it is thinking about 42 days instead of 7, is going to respond much slower. And so one of the ways that this system kind of shorthands this is that CTL is called your fitness. So what is the capacity of the last 6 weeks? ATL is usually called fatigue because it's really like what you are doing recently. And then TSB, which is training stress balance, is the interplay between those two. And that's very often called form, which is this kind of nebulous term of what kind of result are you able to get. If you've got good form, usually you're going to have a good result. If you have bad form, it's not going to go well. And very often it's because you are too tired or too flat, like you haven't been doing enough training recently. And we're going to get into all this a little bit more. We're not going to go super duper into the weeds with TSS and CTL and ATL and all of that stuff, because one thing that's really important to remember, even though it's deeply ingrained into the endurance community at this point, using these particular metrics, and different companies will fiddle with them because of patents and intellectual property and stuff like that. It's all basically the same idea. But the important thing to remember, and this is the thing with any model, is that it is arbitrary. The creators of the model decided to focus on certain things that are going to be more important for that particular algorithm. And in this case, it's all based off of threshold. So if you do 1 hour at threshold, you get a TSS of 100. It doesn't take into account as much things like really high intensity and short intervals and things like that, because it is focusing more on basically an aerobic development. Because remember, threshold is a very important part of your aerobic system. It is the highest sustainable aerobic output that you can do. Basically, what I'm saying here is you need to pick a system to measure load and stick with it, but don't just get completely focused on the TSS, CTL, ATL, TSB system and think that it's gospel, because certain decisions were made, because you have to when you're building a model, about what's important. Another one that you might consider is called session RPE. And it is nice because it actually asks the athlete to rate the particular workout. And it is not going to be as objective as the TSS system, but it's a little bit simpler and it's a little bit more dependent on the particular athlete. And so what you do with session RPE, you simply take the number of minutes of the workout and you multiply it by how hard the athlete says it is on a scale of 1 to 10. So athlete goes out, does a 2-hour workout, 120 minutes, pretty moderate, so they say, it was a 5 out of 10. That gets 600. And you can call it 600 whatever, maybe arbitrary units, 600 AU, something like that. And you can track load that way, because you can then assign a value to every particular workout and then figure out what your training volume for the week was. So say this athlete just does that same exact workout 6 days in a row and takes a day off. By the end of the week, they will have racked up 3,600 AU. And that's a very inexact kind of way of doing it. But what you can see is that maybe they do a 90-minute workout with a lot of intensity. And so 90 minutes, and maybe they say that it's 8 out of 10. So that 90-minute workout is going to be worth 720 AU. So it's more stressful than the 2 hours at 5. I know we're really getting deep into it already, but the thing that I'm really talking about here is, if you want to talk about progressive overload, we need a system that measures training load. Straight up hours isn't great because, again, no hour is created equally. And if you're using the TSS system, that's nice because it does account for intensity. Session RPE accounts for intensity. But we really need to know what's happening. We really can't talk about progressive overload if we don't know what your training load is. So you got to come up with some kind of system to measure it. Okay, part 2, the importance of rest. So when I started training and racing way back in the aughts, there was a guy who was the communications director at the school where I worked. He went by the nickname Captain Dondo, and he had been in cycling for decades at that point. One of those really great cycling dinosaurs who has been around forever and has done everything. And one of the first things that he ever said to me is that training is not where you get fit. Training is just stimulus. Where you get fit is on the couch later when you're resting. And this is totally true. And this goes into the principle of supercompensation, which basically says that if you do a little bit more than you did in the previous training cycle, and then you rest, what's actually going to happen is you are going to be stronger than you were last week and stronger than this current week when you did these intervals, because you have stressed your body and then given it a chance to rebuild so that it can do those kinds of hard efforts in the future. Now, we're probably not going to do just 2 weeks of training and then resting. There are some times where you might want to do that. It depends on your age. It depends on your fitness. It depends on so many different things. And you're not going to leave today with a hard and fast train for this number of weeks and then rest for this number of weeks. It's impossible. How much you need to rest depends on your age, your fitness, how much training you're doing, the intensity of that training that you're doing. Very quickly, we're in so many variables that it's not really something that you're going to be able to track objectively, which is one of my big problems with the whole TSS CTL thing. It purports to tell you these things, and it really only gives you a very fuzzy picture, which is all you're ever going to be able to achieve with any of these systems. I want to be clear about that. Progressive overload and effective training is a combination of art and science. I hate that term. I would much more prefer to use the terms expertise for science, basically like all of the things you know, and then mastery in place of art. Because mastery is the ability to deploy all the information you have in different settings. And progressive overload is definitely something where you need expertise and you need mastery. You're never going to have a completely clear answer. I'm really sorry to say that. So, what does effective training look like when you are using this principle of progressive overload and supercompensation? Remember, supercompensation is you rest and then your body rebounds and is able to do more in the future. When you're training effectively, basically your training, if you were to graph it out, should look like a sawtooth pattern, but a sawtooth pattern that is tilted. So you're going to see training come up a little bit, and then you're going to rest and get into a supercompensation period. You're going to train again, doing more training load than you did in the previous cycle. And remember, that can be duration, that can be intensity, that can be skill work. You rest again, and fitness comes down. But while you're resting, everything is improving in your body. Then you do another training cycle where you do more than the previous training cycle, and so on and so forth. And so it should look like a sawtooth pattern that is basically tilted up, is what we are after. Now, a lot of the times when athletes are not using progressive overload correctly, their fitness, if you were to graph it, looks more like a sawtooth pattern that is parallel. So their fitness comes up, and then maybe they rest too much, or they did too much in that first training cycle and they get sick or they get injured or they get burned out, and their fitness drops back to the place where they started the last training cycle. And then they do the training cycle again, and the same thing happens, and you just end up with this sine wave of fitness rather than like an undulating ramp. And we want more of the undulating ramp than the sine wave. And if you've ever been on that sine wave, that is the definition of a training plateau. And so you're either doing too much because you're having to rest so much to recover from the training that you did, or you're just resting too much. Maybe you're sticking to an old resting pattern that you used years ago, and you don't need it anymore because you're a lot fitter. So this is the reason why be wary of the always do 3 weeks on, 1 week off, which just kind of exists in training circles. That's just one of those things that people started doing and it gained inertia and now everybody does it. Your training cycles might be as short as 10 days. And sometimes they might be as long as like 8 to 12 weeks. There are some superhuman athletes that can continue building load for a long period of time and then need a rest. That's a very extreme example. You are very likely not to be that. But it's also not just going to be 3 weeks on and 1 week off. So you're going to have to experiment. Okay. So now that we've got the principles of progressive overload in place, and we've also got this idea of supercompensation and knowing that we actually need to rest in order to do this, how are we actually going to put this in play? So the first principle is not going to be surprising. Whatever training cycle you're working on, so a microcycle, usually a week, it can be as short as 5 days, as long as 10 days, but a microcycle is usually just like the smallest unit of training that's not just a single workout. So microcycle, a mesocycle, and that might be a block like of a month of training, 2 months of training, 3 months of training, something like that. Or a macrocycle, and a macrocycle is usually half a year or a full season. So whatever training cycle you are working on, so maybe you are building a 3-week block of training for yourself or your athlete. Each of those microcycles in that 3-week block, and we're talking about the week as the microcycle here, needs to be a little bit more than the previous week. And again, it could be duration, it could be intensity, it could be total training load. You need to pick a metric and kind of stick with it. And so over the course of 3 weeks, you are doing more somehow. And it can look like the same number of hours because maybe you are progressing intensity over the course of those weeks. Maybe you're keeping intensity the same and your hours go 9 hours, 10 hours, 11 hours, or something like that. But you've got to progress the training load from cycle to cycle. And so that's what you would do for a microcycle. For a mesocycle, maybe now we're talking about the actual blocks of training. And let's just stick with the old chestnut. Let's just say that that's what you're doing. 3 weeks on, 1 week off. You would look at the whole training load for that month and then make the next mesocycle, the next 4-week block, a little bit more than that. This is pretty vague, so as to be unhelpful almost. But you want to be thinking in how do I keep progressing? And that goes all the way up to how is next year going to be a little bit more than this year? Whether it's, again, volume, duration, intensity, load, skills, you can progress anything. The way you're going to figure this out, and all of you very type A endurance athletes are going to love this, you're going to do this by trial and error. It's really the only way to do it. So what you're going to do, and this is why I said you really need a system for measuring training load. I would start at, anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 weeks of a little bit more load, and then 5 to 7 days of recovery. And so, yeah, I am suggesting that you start roughly in that 3 weeks on, 1 week off kind of model. But you don't need to stay there is the real lesson that I'm talking about, because maybe you get to the end of those 3 weeks and you're like, I'm not really feeling that tired. Or you get to like day 19 and you are dragging ass everywhere. 3 weeks is too long for you. So here's some things that you can track to get a sense of how it's going. So first of all, just general fatigue. And I would really think about this, as I think about a lot of things, on a somewhat subjective scale of 1 to 10. 1 is like, I feel amazing. I am full of carbohydrates. I slept really well. I am ready to go. I don't have any markers of fatigue. And like 10 out of 10 fatigue is like, you shouldn't drive because you're going to fall asleep at the seat of your car and you're going to kill someone or kill yourself. So 10 out of 10 is like, I am so drained that I am literally like falling apart. We never want to be at 10 out of 10 fatigue. It is an incredibly unhealthy place for your body to be for so many reasons. Mentally, physically, hormonally, emotionally. Don't get to 10 out of 10. But it is something you should be tracking. Like, where am I? And maybe over the course of a 3-week block, at the end of the first week, you're at a 4 out of 10, sort of lightly fatigued. And the end of the second week, you're moderately fatigued, or maybe 5 out of 10. And then the end of the third week, you're like, I'm starting to build some real fatigue here. You're more sort of like a 6 to a 7 out of 10. Track that. And what are you kind of looking for in that case? I mean, just general body feel, soreness that is sticking around, your legs feel heavy. A real marker of fatigue is that you're sort of breathing heavier or more deeply than you normally would at rest. You're yawning a lot. Yawning is a way for the body to both get rid of CO2 and to get more oxygen in. It's a real sign that some fatigue is building. So you kind of build this picture off of just how your body is feeling and some of those markers. Soreness. If soreness is lingering for more than 3 or 4 days, that's a real sign that you are not really recovering. So think about that. I mean, if you are new to lifting, you are going to do a lift, you're going to be sore for a week because your body is like, oh my God, I am not ready for that. And so maybe the first week that you're lifting, you do like one lift and one core workout, because really doing more than that is going to overload your body. So, and we get soreness through endurance training as well. Some of you that are really well trained might not remember that. But if you do a workout, like a cycling workout or a swimming workout or a running workout, and you're still sore 3 or 4 days later, that workout was probably too much. So as you are getting into these training blocks, tracking that soreness and thinking, okay, like if I'm really having some soreness that's lingering in the third week of this block, maybe 3 weeks is too long. Diet. If your diet starts to be wacky, whether you are like ravenous and you're just like eating all the time, that's a sign that probably you're not fueling the workouts effectively. So look at that first. But then the other thing that can happen is that you just lose your appetite completely. That's a big red flag in both directions. So if your diet is suddenly like if your appetite is through the roof or it disappears completely, that's a sign that you're getting to that point where you're going to need to take some recovery. For women, if you lose your period, that is a sign that you are training too much or too hard or a combination of both. Being amenorrheal is hormonally kind of disastrous for you. Really try to avoid it. It's not good for you. It is not the mark of an elite athlete. Lots of elite female athletes don't get their period anymore. That's not a good thing. It's not something to aim for. It means that you are starting down a really damaging path in your training. So please, if that happens, talk to a doctor, talk to your coach, figure out a different approach. Sleep. Again, just like diet, too much or too little. If you're like sleeping all the time, if you like can't get out of bed, if you're sleeping through your alarm, something like that, or your sleep has just suddenly begun to suck and like you're having trouble getting down or staying down, that's another sign that your body is really clamoring out for some rest. Mood. If you are suddenly the grumpiest person and you are swearing at your spouse or you're being mean to your kids or people at work are starting to avoid you, road rage is a big one. If you suddenly are getting like really pissed off by everybody else on the road, remember, if everyone is an asshole, you are the asshole. And mood is a real sign that you're doing a little too much if your mood is suddenly grumpy all of the time. So that's another sign that maybe it's time to back things off a little bit. And then stress. I left stress for last because stress is the big one. people try to compartmentalize stress. Like I got my family stress over here. I got relationship stress over here. I got work stress over here. I got friend stress over here. And I got training stress over here in these like 6 different buckets. There are not 6 different buckets. There is one bucket that everything goes into. And a lot of the time in our modern world as adults, it is very, very hard to dial back other aspects that are stressful in our existence. You know, we can't just tell our spouse, like, hey, I'm not going to help out with the kids anymore. That's not going to fly. You can negotiate things at work. You know, if you are getting rocked at work and the load is too much, then yeah, you can probably negotiate something with your boss. That's a really good thing to have done. But very often, the easiest lever to turn is your training. And yes, none of you are going to want to hear that. But if you weren't super stressed out before this training block, and now you are, and the only thing that's changed is your training load, that's a sign that you've kind of gotten the loading incorrect. So you might want to shorten up the training block or, you know, drop the intensity of it. Again, I hope you're hearing by now that this principle of progressive overload is a series of levers and dials, and that you are going to increase whatever the load is by turning duration, by turning intensity, by adding more skills, which will probably drop the intensity, by adding more recovery, which will really drop the intensity. Again, you got to know what the thing is that you're trying to develop. If you're trying to develop general endurance fitness, where your goal eventually is to probably go longer and faster, you really can't stress both endurance and speed at the same time. I really want you to hear that last part. Becoming a better endurance athlete is a series of assembling building blocks. And so you might progress endurance for a little while and have a block where you're just working on endurance. And then you might have a block where you really need to work on intensity, like way over threshold, something like that, doing VO2 max work, or you're getting towards a race and you might be doing some anaerobic capacity work. You can progress anything, but you have to decide what you want to progress, and just getting faster and more enduring, that's the entire picture. And to get to that, we're going to progress these little energy systems that make up going longer and going faster at the same time. So, in conclusion, like I said earlier, getting progressive overload correct is very much a function of expertise, knowing what individual workouts are going to do to you in terms of fatigue and also what you're going to kind of get out of them. So that's sort of the science part of it, and that's kind of the numbers part of it. And then mastery, which is the more artful side of it, where you're kind of looking back at your past history, taking notes about your athletes if you're a coach, and sort of assembling a slightly more abstract, full picture of who this athlete is and how they develop, even if that athlete is you. And learning through trial and error what you can progress and how much. Looking for those signs that you're doing too much of general fatigue, soreness, diet, sleep, mood, and stress, to then modulate those dials of how long is the training block, how much duration am I aiming for, how much intensity am I aiming for. And if you do this correctly, where you are stacking periods where you do more than the previous period, and then resting effectively, you are going to get really fast. But we need to do this without tipping over into injury, burnout, or sickness, which are the 3 things that are going to happen if you put too much load into your body and not enough recovery. So that's why I really suggest that you start small. Start with a training block that's 2 to 3 weeks long, and then maybe 4 or 5 days of recovery. And be really aggressive about tracking how your body is responding to the daily training. Take little notes. Where am I at today in terms of fatigue? How's my mood? How's my sleep? All of those things, and kind of assemble a picture of what the training is doing to you. Then rest, repeat the block, and then do some sort of assessment to figure out, okay, is it working? Because we really, if it's not changing anything, then the system is not right. And so this is why coaches and athletes do regular physiological testing, regular field testing, and that's a topic we're going to get into in a later show. But we need to keep score. And if there's a theme from this episode, it's about keeping score. You need to figure out a system for tracking load. Then you need to track that load over a full training block, also tracking fatigue and everything like that. After you repeat 2 or 3 training blocks, you need to keep score again, measuring, did I improve at the thing I was trying to improve? So remember, if you're just trying to build endurance, the simple assessment is like, I used to get really, really tired at 3 hours on my bike ride, and now I can ride 4 or 5 hours and I'm not getting as tired. Awesome. You have effectively achieved progressive overload. If it's something more like intensity, and maybe you're tracking, okay, did my FTP go up? Did my 5K pace go up? Am I running the same speed at a lower heart rate, which means that you've raised your fitness? So it really all gets back to keeping score. Tracking your training load, tracking the load of the system, assessing what your progressive overload is doing. And I really hope this was helpful. Progressive overload is a really powerful principle. It's probably the principle behind effective endurance training. And if you can master it, you are going to be a great athlete and a great coach. So thanks for coming to the infirmary today. I hope after this talk, you'll be able to go out and soon you'll be feeling better. Thanks for listening.